When I first learned of Harlan Hubbard, I was teaching at a University of Pittsburgh campus in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and my office mate, it turns out, had gone to college across the river from Payne Hollow at Hanover College, and their book Payne Hollow had just been published. And he said, his name was David Ward. He said,
David Ward, yeah.
we should go down to Payne Hollow. I'd like you to meet these people. I was teaching a course on the American dream of success at the time, and it seemed very germane that it was a different kind of success and a different definition of the very word American. So we drove down, and these were long drives out of Johnstown, and came to see Harlan and Anna. And I was quite taken by Payne Hollow, and indeed by the freshness of their lives. Very taken.
What year would have this been?
Huh?
What year would this been?
It would have been 73, 74, somewhere in there when the Payne Hollow was published by the Aikens Press. And then came down with groups of students, too. We thought that was extremely important, that not just we, but young people younger than us would learn out with a little book, and it turned out to be a journal that he had been keeping. I said, well, what year was that, Harlan? He said, well, that's 1929. Now that went back a ways. In fact, when he was only 29 years old, he had started journalizing then. And I said, how many years have you been doing that? And he said, well, a long time. And I think I stopped in 1968, so that was quite a run. And he started reading, and I realized this is a treasure trove. I had studied Thoreau and Thoreau's journals and realized this was something that definitely needed to be preserved and definitely needed to be publicized. But furthermore, as any journal, needed to be condensed. So we did that over about 7 years, actually. I used to come down with manuscripts and we'd work on them. Finally, it was in shape, and I searched for an editor here and there, and then I went to Lexington. And lo and behold, Jerry Crouch, who was then the editor, said, we're interested, and they agreed to publish the book, and we started working it into shape. I had already edited the journals, but now we needed form, we needed divisions, we needed illustrative material too. So I came back to Harlan. I said, we need some drawings. The raw journals themselves are very interesting, but to the non-knowing reader, they need a few pictures. And I think he did about a dozen sketches, all of which are now at the Filson in Louisville. I just gave a whole bunch of stuff to them. And that's really the long and the short of my knowledge of them. I came here a number of times. I stayed at the house. I stayed at the other house that we went to
The visitor cabin,
a couple of times. And always learned something when I came here, always. One of the things that most impressed me, and I'm sure you've seen the book, was their list of books they read to each other. That incredibly thick, three hole notebook folder or whatever it was that they kept. And the esoteric nature of what they were reading, and not just in English, French mostly. And then just gradually, when I came to know more about them, he said, well, you know, I've written music for Anna. I wrote a play for her. You know, he made these beautiful candlesticks, which I'm sure you have here for her. And it was a very devoted, I thought, relationship. There was a very, very wonderful woman who also has written of them, Mia Cunningham, of whom you know. Did you know her?
No.
Well, she used to visit Anna when she was a young
She was Anna's niece.
girl. And she always thought that Anna played second fiddle, kind of literally, to Harlan, even though she was a better fiddler than he was. And her book has a little bit of that, and it's called From Out of the Shadows. And I worked with her, and she also had the copies of the journals that she used before Don Wallace used them for his work on Harlan. So after I did the original journals, which was a huge box, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and then edited them down to the present book, um, I was able and happy to share that with other scholars who were doing their own work, not in the traditional way, not in the copyrighted way. We never copyrighted the journal draft. We simply said, you want it, take it home, photocopy it, use it, and it was the spirit of Payne Hollow, really, of a different kind of scholarship, very different from what I had done in my doctoral work at Iowa, obviously, and I was just thrilled to death to have been associated with them, with the people at the University Press, and with any number of humble, understated people like Jimmy and his wife, who you meet and think, these people know nothing about Harlan and Anna. Wrong answer, obviously. And I'm sure that's the case with you too, that I have been privileged to have had a small part of remembering this place.
That's really great.
That's what it was about. Tell you one thing, he could let you know where you stood. I was a grown man. I was 45 years old, I think, and he said, Vincent, why don't you go down the river there, or down to the creek and get some water? And he had a yoke that you put over your shoulders and 2 buckets. And he said, do not fill the buckets over halfway fill. It's too hard to walk up the hill. Well, I went down, I filled both of the buckets, and I came up that hill, and he gave me what for. And he said, that's you shouldn't be doing that. And he minced no words.
What did he say?
He said, I told you to bring up half a bucket each one. You could have tripped. Anything could have happened. His concern was, I live here. I know this terrain. I'm trying to teach you how you live here. And that's a simple lesson, and you didn't even learn it. There I was walking along, being a college professor, not knowing how to dip water out of the creek.
Well, he probably thought you were trying to impress him by carrying away.
Probably. It wouldn't surprise me. Whatever he thought, he made it perfectly clear he wasn't thinking very happily about it. That's for sure. Yes, he was a fine man, and for me, I was never very close to my own father, but I was closer in a way to him because I always learned important things from him as a grown man every time I came here, every single time.
So I take it you didn't come here all the time just to deal with the journals. After a while, it was just...
Oh, I came for many
friends.
years, though. No, I didn't come here all the time for journals by a long shot. In fact, that was the last 7 years, really, of his life that I was here doing that. But in the previous years, there were social visits, and we talked about cooking, and we talked about, books, and we talked about Thoreau, and we talked about everybody, and about traveling. And, I read a lot of travel books, as did he, and at the time, I had become a fan of Larry McMurtry, the Western. Well, you knew him if you were in the movies. You certainly knew about him. And we talked about literature and who the good writers were and all of that. It was really, really, really very interesting. We talked about the influence that Whistler had on him, which was a very, very not quite well-known aspect of Harlan Hubbard and his work, because so much of it is like Whistler's, not what's there, but what's not there. Whistler did a series of etchings of the Thames River in London, and they're called the Thames River Suite. And by accident, once on the way back to graduate school from New York City, I stopped in Allentown, Pennsylvania at the Art Museum and saw these etchings. And they stuck in my mind forever. And then when Harlan did the drawings, the pen and ink drawings for the book, I thought, that's Whistler. Harlan built frames like we used to use when I was a kid to sift sand when I was working. We were building a house and I was sifting sand to make stucco. Anyway, they built them, but they built them to put spices on. And then they put them overhead during the summer and dried all their basil and savory and, everything they had. It was just a wonderful thing to see.
That was up above the loft in the main room?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. And then, as I mentioned to you, there was a box that I don't know for what reason, but it was that Russian ammunition box. I think he names it by name in the shanty boat. And that was a neat thing. And then all about stoves. There was so much about stoves. The stove of which I saw that beautiful cast iron one in the studio. I would love to have a cast iron stove like that more than you could know. And there was so much there for me that reminded me of my own childhood in Upper New York State many, many years ago, because we were very broke after the war in New York City. My father worked in the shipyards. The war ended, WW2, and off we went to the middle of nowhere, to Delaware County, New York, to a farm that had no electricity, no running water, no, as they used to say in the country, no nothing. And we had kerosene lamps and all the memories of the smell of a house that you walked into that had oil lamps instead of electricity, the level of light in such a house, the fact that when my father smoked a cigarette and inhaled, the whole room glowed for just a moment from it. All of that, when I went to Payne Hollow and when it got to be dusk and I was a guest there, I would just sit there and I would be transported back to my childhood, which I am thankful for now, that I was so able to empathize with everything that was going on in that place. He was smoking fish. He was, pulling them out of the river. He had a live bait box. None of that we had. He had goats. He milked the goats. All of this reminded me of milking Holstein cattle and taking the milk to the spring tank and all of that. And I was reinvested in the past by them.
You had mentioned about bringing her
Smoke bell.
Yeah.
She had several. They had several, obviously, kerosene lanterns, two of which were in a rack that I hope you find with two wings on it. It was just a little rack that the lanterns went on, and then there were two aluminum wings that went like this. She wanted, and for reasons I cannot fathom, she said, I'd love to have a bell. It was a white glass, milk glass thing that looked like a Christmas bell. And you hung it over the chimney of a kerosene lamp, and it caught the carbon from going up into the room. Well, there was no reason to capture carbon down there in that cabin, that's for sure. But I came back some months later, and I walked in, and we were there for a while. I said, Anna, where's the smoke bell that you wanted? And she said, oh, Vince, it was too much trouble to clean that every day. I gave it away. I thought, that is simplicity in its simplest form. She cleaned the kerosene lantern chimneys, as I recall, almost daily. So that when you sat down at night and they lit those lanterns, they shone. And then, the light would be on for 2 or 3 hours, I guess, and they'd read or write or do correspondence with friends or whatever, and then retire. So that was a very, very fun memory. With Harlan and Anna were given as a gift a Sony, the radio, the small radio about the size of an iPhone now,
The Sony Walkman.
and they were not, as we all know, into technology, but they were always open to a technology that was worth it.
Yeah.
And a Sony, all it took was a couple of batteries, which lasted a fair amount of time. They would turn on the Sony, and it had two places where you put the earphones in, not one but two. And he and Anna would sit and do their correspondence at that table, which you could roll around, which I loved and always coveted too, and listen to the symphony in Cincinnati on their Sony Walkman. And of course, you've read the books and know that they used to go to the symphony quite regularly as well. So the train was called the accommodation, I think.
Yeah.
But
Now, I'd heard about the Sony Walkman just recently from somebody, and they said kind of the same thing, how they listened to it. And I was telling people down below tonight, it was like his issue wasn't technology in general; it was the noise.
mm-hmm.
He didn't like motors because of the noise.
Yeah.
He wanted to hear the world around him.
Mm-hmm.
Like when he talks about not using gas rototillers, it was like because he wanted to hear the birds while he was gardening.
The only sound I think that was okay to him was the sound of a towboat.
Yeah.
The towboat coming up and down the river, that thrum was a different thing than all that whiny stuff that you saw and heard on the river a lot.
Yeah, I think anything to do with old-time tugboats, steamboats, anything like that was fine noise.
Yeah.
But a chainsaw cutting wood was unnecessary noise.
Yeah, even the sound of the chainsaw wasn't exactly music to him when Paul did it.
No, he didn't. That was something
It was a compromise.
It was a compromise, yeah.
And a wonderful compromise, too. It kept them warm all winter. And one of my fondest memories when I was visiting is I was up in the upper room. I had slept. I get up very early, before he did actually, and stood up and looked down to the lower room toward the river, and then walked down, and I saw him down there, just standing in the dawn, looking out at the river, just being happy to be alive. And I was absolutely transformed by it. I wrote a review for Jessica. I don't think it's been published because I tried to make it too personal. I don't think it was the kind of review that, a lot of newspapers are looking for, but it included that memory of Harlan standing on the river edge. I guess he was going out to check the trot lines. I'm not sure, but it was quite a morning. And then he would have put the soy and wheat cereal over the fire in a water bath, and the cracked soy and cracked wheat was in another pot in the water, and it steamed for an hour or two, and then when he came back in, there was breakfast every day, steamed wheat and soybeans, and it was wonderful too, wonderful. But she always, when we showed up with a couple jars of Hellman's mayonnaise, and she was thrilled, A, because she liked the mayonnaise, but B, because you could recycle the jars and use them for canning.
There are still plenty of them down in the basement. I didn't open up the underneath the house. I should have, but there's still a lot of those down there.
And down there used to be where he kept the celery. You know that in the fall? Mm-hmm. Turn it on. He used to keep carrots after the season had ended in buckets, and celery in buckets. Maybe cabbage. I don't think you'd have to dig it or put a cabbage in anything, but the carrots and the celery they put in sand or soil or something, and it stayed for quite some time into the autumn. I had come a couple times and had fresh celery, and I said to Harlan, "This really is pretty." He said, "Oh, that's right down in the basement." Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, it was a neat thing. Very, very interesting.
Talk a little bit about your associations, if any, with Paul during the time that Harlan was still here, as well as after.
Paul was a saint, wasn't he? To come here to help two people who were getting along in years, to do things, cut wood especially, that enabled them to live their lives out here at Payne Hollow until, of course, for Harlan, he was so terminally ill that he had to go into Madison, right? And pass his final time. But it was the few times I saw him when I was here, Paul was so busy that when visitors came, he just kept right on doing what Paul did. He kept on working because he was here to help Harlan and Anna. And I admired that. And then he told me a bit about his sculpture work and, his artistic endeavors, which were what they were. And then I don't know, not many years ago, I wanted to come back, and I called him and I said, Paul, I've moved to Kentucky. I live down south of Lexington, and I'd like to bring my wife. And he said, fine. And so for that one time, before the Hollow became really overrun and run down, he took us down there. He was already having heart problems, I believe. And opened all the scrapbooks, all of which I'm sure you have here, many of which were deteriorating rather severely, and told us about his time with Harlan. And it was quite delightful. Then I called him a number of times thereafter, and he put me off. And he said, "No, come call me next month," and then next month, and months turned into years. And I finally realized I'm not going to get to go back to Payne Hollow. Paul's not going to go back there. And it was so. And he was, concerned for the security of the house, and on the other hand, extremely guilty about not being able to care for it. God love him. He did his best, but he couldn't do anything. And it was really not pleasant to see. And he became somewhat irritable, of which I don't blame him either. People were bothering him. Come on, Paul, take us down to the house. He just didn't want to say, look, I'm getting infirm, I'm not feeling well, and the house isn't very good repair. And he kept saying, I haven't had time to weed whack it. That was his reasoning. And you probably know as much about that as I do. But that was what was going on. And when I did come one time, I could tell when we walked in, with that one time, it was all stuffy. He hadn't himself been in it in months, probably. And, thank God you and the people around you and saved it. But it could have been burned to the ground easily any number of times by, boaters who came along and wanted to see a bonfire. To Paul's credit, when I came down here and saw him, there was a kerosene lantern holder stand that had been at Payne Hollow for many years. It held 2 kerosene oil lamps, and Harlan and Anna used to sit at night by the light of those and write letters and read to each other for years and years and years. And I really coveted that. And I'll be frank about it. I thought it was a wonderful thing. It reminded me of my own boyhood. And I said to Paul, I would really love to buy it if you would sell it to me. And Paul looked me in the most incredibly intense way and said, Vince, in this house there's a place for everything, and everything has its place. And I cannot let it go. It belongs here in Payne Hollow, in this house. I know a number of people, as the famous American divine Cotton Mather said, there are visible and invisible saints in this world. And you guys are the invisible saints. To those of us who came here and saw Payne Hollow at its apex, and then saw it go down, and the sad times where we thought there will not be a Payne Hollow. What will happen is exactly the same thing that happened to Thoreau's cabin. It was taken off the property, made into a shed or something, and then disappeared. It went down the river a time. But at least Payne Hollow did not.